Hello guys, welcome back to the MedLife. So in today's video, we're going to talk about cerebellum. In the previous videos, we have already talked about cerebrum and its blood supply and its functional areas. Now let's talk about cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum, if you see it in the picture. This whole thing was the cerebrum, and on the inferior and posterior side of the brain, we see this cerebellum. So the cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. So the largest part is cerebrum, and cerebellum is the second largest part. And as I said, it's located in the posterior side of the brain and in the posterior cranial fossa, underneath the tentorium cerebelli, and behind pons and medulla oblongata. And it's separated from the pons and medulla by fourth ventricle. So it has two hemispheres, the right and the left hemisphere, and they're joined by a structure called the vermis. So let's discuss about the functions of the cerebellum. It has three major functions: maintenance of posture or the equilibrium. So it deals with the balance of the human body and maintenance of the muscle tone and coordination of voluntary motor activity. So it is involved in the coordination of voluntary motor activity. Remember, if there is an injury to cerebellum, does not mean that the body is paralyzed. No, it's only not coordinated. So it has internal features and external features. Let's talk first about the external features. So it has two surfaces, the superior and the inferior, two notches, superior cerebellar notch, inferior cerebellar notch, and three main fissures: the primary fissure, horizontal fissure, and posterolateral fissure. So here is a view of cerebellum. You can see right over here. So this structure in the middle is the vermis, and these are the hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, which are joined by the vermis. And these are the parts of vermis: the culmen, and the declive, the folium. Then, yeah, this is the inferior view. We can see it right over here. So, yeah. So the cerebellum is divided, it has two major subdivisions: the anatomical subdivision and the functional subdivision. So let's first discuss about the anatomical subdivisions. So anatomically, it is divided into three lobes: the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. If you see in this picture, so this is the cerebellum from a medial view. If you cut it from the middle, this is the medial view. So you can see in this picture, you can see the primary fissure right over here. This is the primary fissure. Then over here we have the posterolateral fissure, and the horizontal fissure, we can see it over here, but normally we should see it from a superior view. Then the anterior lobe is the lobe anterior to the primary fissure. The posterior lobe, or also called the middle lobe, is the lobe posterior to the primary fissure. This blue part over here, the entire thing is the posterior lobe. And then right over here, this one is the flocculonodular lobe. So the flocculonodular lobe is the smallest lobe, and it's actually on the inferior surface. So let's talk about the functional subdivisions. Functionally, it is divided into three parts: Archicerebellum, Paleocerebellum, and Neocerebellum. So these names are gotten because of their development. So as the name suggests, Archicerebellum was developed the first. So it was the first one to develop in the cerebellum. Then the Paleocerebellum and the Neocerebellum, as the name suggests, is the newest part of cerebellum. So the Archicerebellum, as I said, is the oldest part of the cerebellum to develop, or it's also called the vestibular cerebellum. We'll talk about it, why it's called like that. So it has two major parts, the flocculonodular lobe and the lingula. So the flocculonodular lobe, we have already talked about it. It's on the inferior surface of the cerebellum. And the lingula is a part of vermis. Then what does it do? It controls the axial musculature, equilibrium, and bilateral movements. So for the equilibrium, we need information from the ear. That's why we receive connections from the vestibular nerve. So we know the eighth cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve. So the vestibular part of that nerve comes to cerebellum for equilibrium and balance. That's why it's also called the vestibular cerebellum. The second part is the paleocerebellum. The paleocerebellum is the next part of cerebellum to develop. It has three major parts: the pyramids, uvula, and the anterior lobe. The anterior lobe, we have already talked about it, anterior to the primary fissure. The pyramids and the uvula are parts of vermis as well. And it controls the tone, posture, and crude movements of limbs. So for the limbs, it has to get information and receive information from the spinal cord, because all those sensory and motor nerves go from spinal cord. So it receives information from the spinocerebellar tracts. Then the neocerebellum, or the cerebral cerebellum. So it's the most recent part of the cerebellum to develop, and it's majorly the posterior lobe of the cerebellum, and it occupies the largest part of the cerebellum. It controls the smooth performance of skilled voluntary movements. So if you want to move your fingers or your hand, your arm, your legs, your foot, like in a very unique way, very smoothly, that's related to this part of cerebellum, the neocerebellum or the cerebral cerebellum. So it has three major tracts that are coming to it. From the cortex, from the cerebral cortex, that's why it's called cortico, and also from pons. So cortico pontocerebellar tracts. From cerebellum, from pons, and from the cerebral cortex. So cortico pontocerebellar. Because this cortex is cerebral cortex, it's called the cerebral cerebellum. Then now let's discuss about the internal features of the cerebellum. So it has a white matter and gray matter. So the white matter has a cerebellar cortex and the intracerebellar nuclei. And the gray matter has intrinsic fibers, afferent and efferent fibers. So let's start with the cerebellar cortex. So cerebellar cortex has three major layers: the molecular, the Purkinje, and the granular layer. So let's start with molecular. The molecular layer has dendrites of Purkinje cells. It has basket cells and stellate cells. Then the Purkinje layer, it's a very small and thin layer. It's a single layer of Purkinje cells. So those Purkinje cells, they go to the molecular layer and synapse with collaterals from the basket cells, axons of granule cells, and clumping fibers. Then the third layer is the granular layer. So it has too many cells, too many granule cells. That's why it's called the granular layer. And they're very small and closely packed to each other. It also has large Golgi cells. And its neurons are majorly multipolar, which means they have 3 to 6 dendrites and only one axon. So this is a picture of cerebellar cortex. So you see over here, this one is the molecular layer, And over here on this line, it's not very obvious here. This line is the Purkinje layer. It's a very single and a very thin layer. Then this is the granule layer or the granular layer. Then the intracellular nuclei. So in the nuclei in cerebellum, we have four major nuclei: dentate, emboliform, globus, and vestigial. In able to memorize these easily, there is a mnemonic: don't eat greasy food. D stands for dentate, E emboliform, G globus, and F vestigial. Don't eat greasy food. Now let's talk about white matter. We have already talked about the gray matter, which has the cerebral cortex and the nuclei. Now let's talk about the white matter. So as I said, it has three major fibers: the intrinsic, afferent, and efferent. So the difference between them is that the intrinsic fibers remain inside the cerebellum. They connect different parts of the cerebellum to each other. And the afferent and efferent fibers connect cerebellum to the outside of the cerebellum, like in to cerebrum, to brainstem, to spinal cord, and other parts. So the afferent are coming to the cerebellum, and the efferent are going from the cerebellum. And we have the cerebellar peduncles. There are three major cerebellar peduncles. First of all, we should know what cerebellar peduncles are. So they're actually structures or bundles that connect cerebellum with structures of the brainstem. So we have three: superior, middle, and inferior. So the superior cerebellar peduncle connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle one connects it to the pons, and the inferior one connects it with medulla oblongata. Here are the pictures. So this is the midbrain, pons, and medulla. So we have the brainstem right over here. So we have the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. So the inferior cerebellar peduncles, which we said are connected to the medulla oblongata and cerebellum. So they're on the posterolateral aspect of the upper half of the medulla oblongata. And so this one, the inferior cerebellar peduncles, consist mainly of afferent fibers to the cerebellum from the spinal cord, the olivary nuclei, the reticular formation of the medulla, and the vestibular nuclei and nerves. It also transmits efferent fibers from cerebellum to medulla oblongata, and also vestibular nuclei and the reticular formation. So it has both afferent and efferent fibers. Then the middle cerebellar peduncle are the one that connects it to the pons. So what they have is afferent. They only have afferent fibers, which transmit the impulses from pontine nuclei to the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. So that's why they're called the pontocerebellar fibers. So, and the third one and last one is the superior cerebellar peduncles, which connect it to the midbrain from cerebellum. And it is a principal efferent pathway from the cerebellum and its fibers that arise mainly in the dentate nucleus. So we already talked about that, the dentate nucleus of the cerebellum. So the midbrain are majorly efferent, the pons are majorly afferent, and the medulla oblongata has both of them. So the blood supply of cerebellum. So the blood supply of the cerebellum is majorly done by three major arteries: the superior cerebellar artery and inferior cerebellar arteries. The inferior cerebellar arteries are divided into two: anterior inferior cerebellar artery and posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So the anterior inferior cerebellar artery is this one. It majorly supplies the lateral surfaces. majorly on the inferior surface and a bit on the superior surface of the cerebellum. And we have the superior cerebellum, which supplies majorly the superior surface of the cerebellum. And we have the posterior inferior cerebellum, which supplies the majorly the inferior surface and the posterior surface of the cerebellum. So the superior cerebellar artery and the anterior inferior cerebellar artery are both originate from basilar artery, but the posterior inferior cerebellar artery originates from the vertebral artery. So this is another view of cerebellum right over here. It's a structure on the posterior side of the brain. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe to the MedLife.